Welcome to the wonderful world of worms. This lecture covers chapter 9.4 from your textbook. Listen to the lecture using your headphones and take notes in your notebook. Make sure to listen carefully to what I'm saying, since not everything will be written on the slides. Pause or repeat a section if you need to, and make sure to write down any questions you have for when I get back. Let's play a game. Is it a worm? No, this is a mealworm, which is actually the larval stage of a beetle. If you remember, we did our mealworms lab in the beginning of the year. Ready for round two? Is it a worm? Yes, this is a marine worm, or a flatworm, that lives on coral reefs. Is it a worm? Yes, this is a flatworm called a planarian. The two little dots that you see are the eye spots that make them look pretty cute. Is it a worm? Yes, this is a parasitic nematode. Is it a worm? No, this is a millipede. Is it a worm? We have a few more. If you consider gummy worms living. Is it a worm? Yes, this is another marine flatworm like the one we saw before. These tend to live on coral reefs, and they have very bright colors to detract their predators. Is this a worm? Yes, it's a very large earthworm. Is this a worm? Yes, it's a leech, which, contrary to common belief, is a worm. Is this a worm? Yes, this is one of the largest tapeworms ever recorded. This was found in human intestines. Can you imagine having a worm that size in your stomach? Last but not least, is this a worm? No. This is ringworm, which, if you remember, is a fungal infection found on your feet. Fun fact, make sure you write this down so I know you are paying attention, is that the largest worm ever recorded was 22 feet long, and it was found in Australia. All right. Now, worms fall under what domain? Hopefully you said Eukarya, and hopefully you recognize that worms are in the kingdom Animalia. There are 3 different phyla of worms. We have Platyhelminthes, which are commonly known as flatworms. We have Nematoda, which are commonly known as roundworms. And we have phylum Annelida, also known as segmented worms. Now, all worms are invertebrates. This means that they do not have a backbone. Worms are the most simple organism that we've learned about so far that have bilateral symmetry. If you remember, bilateral means that there is one line of symmetry that divides the body into 2 equal halves. Animals with bilateral symmetry tend to have their sense organs, like their eyes and their mouth and their nose or whiskers, concentrated in the head region or in the front of the body. Worms have all 4 levels of organization, including cells, tissues, organs, and organ systems. One of the worm's organ systems is their nervous system. Worms are the simplest organisms with brains. Their brain isn't very complex. It's basically just a small bundle of nerve tissue. This nerve tissue, though, helps them to detect food, predators, and have a sense of their surroundings. The nerve cells in the nerve tissue can detect light, touch, and vibrations, and those nerve cells then tell the rest of the body how to react. For example, see how this worm in the GIF responds to the man's touch. Ah! Worms can reproduce sexually and asexually. When they reproduce asexually, they can break up into separate pieces, which will each turn into a new organism. In some species of worms, you can cut them into several pieces, all of which will develop into a new animal. In sexual reproduction, sometimes there are males and females, and other times a worm can have both parts, similar to a sponge. We call those hermaphrodites. And like with all sexual reproduction, it involves the transfer of sperm and egg cells. Now we're going to break up the worms into their three phyla. First, we'll talk about flatworms, or Platyhelminthes. Flatworms are flat and soft. They include colorful marine flatworms that are found on coral reefs. They include an organism called a planaria, which is often used in science research. And they include something called flukes, or tapeworms. Some flatworms are free-living organisms. This means that they feed on dead or decaying material, and they do not rely on another organism. Some examples of free-living flatworms are planarians or marine flatworms. Other flatworms are parasites, or organisms that live inside or on another organism. Parasites will take nutrients and food from their host. Some examples of parasitic flatworms include tapeworms or flukes. Maybe you've heard of people getting a tapeworm in their stomach, which can come from eating raw meat. And the tapeworm can take nutrients that we need, therefore making us sick. Our next phyla is roundworms, or nematodes. Organisms in the phylum Nematoda have circular bodies that are pointed at one end, kind of like a wet noodle. Roundworms have a one-way digestive tract, meaning that food goes in one way, and out the other. Roundworms can be parasitic or free-living. Some might infect your dogs or cats, and so they might get flea or tick medicine that will prevent the transfer of roundworms. Some types of roundworms include hookworms or heartworms. So maybe you've heard of your dog or cat taking heartworm medication. These can be transferred through tick or flea bites. Something that I thought was pretty interesting was this roundworm called the guinea worm. And the guinea worm is a parasitic nematode. Remember, the scientific name for roundworms is Nematoda. So the guinea worm is this parasitic nematode that infects people who drink unclean water. So it's very common in Africa and third world countries. If you read back to the Old Testament, you see that guinea worm parasitism, or infection by guinea worms, shows up in a lot of old stories in ancient Greece, in ancient Rome, in the Bible. And what I think is cool is that in order to get rid of the guinea worm, physicians or doctors would use a stick, and they would put the person who was infected by the worm in a bath of cold water, and that would cause the worm to want to come to the surface to lay its eggs. And the doctor would then start to roll the worm around a stick. If you want to see it, there's some gross pictures. I'm happy to show you. But you can imagine that it looks something like this. And so this story of the guinea worm and the way that doctors used to extract it from people is where our modern day symbol of medicine comes from. So maybe you've seen this symbol on a paramedic or on a doctor's jacket or coat or something like that. So I thought that story was kind of interesting. Those worms can grow up to 3 feet long, and they're as thin as a noodle. So the doctors would have to do it very slowly, and it could take up to a week to get the entire worm out of your system. Again, ask me if you want pictures. All right. Our last phylum of worms is Annelida, or segmented worms. Annelids, or organisms in the phylum Annelida, have bodies that are made up of many linked sections called segments. Some organs are even repeated in each segment, but others, like the hearts or like the intestines, go through the entire body. Segmented worms have a one-way digestive tract, meaning that food goes in one way and out the other. They also have a closed circulatory system, which means that they have hearts and blood vessels. I say hearts because annelids, or segmented worms, have more than one heart. And that heart pumps blood through blood vessels, or little tubes, throughout the body. Some examples of segmented worms include earthworms, which we're familiar with, leeches, right? You can kind of see the little segments here on the earthworm and on the leech, on the feather duster worm. Kind of looks like a feather duster that you clean your house with. And here's another earthworm, pretty big guy. And here's another example of a feather duster worm. That is all that I have for you. Please see Edline for your homework. Make sure to write down any questions you have, and we'll discuss this next time.